Welcome everyone to this special NAP7 author interview. My name is Mike Charlesworth and I'm an editor of Anaesthesia, and today I'm delighted to be joined by the authors of two papers which are both available today. So welcome to Amira and Tim and Yas. So can you just introduce yourselves and tell us about who you are and your roles with these two great papers? Start with Amira.
Yeah, I'm Amira. I'm a consultant anaesthetist working at the IUH, Royal United Hospital in Bath, and I've been leading on the baseline surveys or the baseline aspect of NAP7, being involved since 2019 as a trainee, as a NAP clinical research fellow.
Tim?
I'm Tim Cook. I'm a much older consultant anaesthetist, also in Bath, working with Amira. And at the college, I've been the lead for the National Audit Projects programme for a little while. So that's my role for the National Audit Projects.
And last but not least, Yas as well.
I'm Jas Saw. I'm an anaesthetist intensivist at Southmead Hospital in Bristol, and I've been the clinical lead for NAP7, so doing a lot of the day-to-day work and managing the project. So I'm the manager and Tim's the sort of director of football, so to speak.
And it seems like a long time ago now, where we had, I think the four of us were together when we talked about the methods paper, which seems like a distant memory now, doesn't it? And it's great that we're all here now talking about the first in a series of results paper. We've obviously already had the other paper earlier on this year, but we're going to start seeing some serious results papers coming through now, and this is the first of those. So it's really great to see that published today. And we are going to focus on these two papers. The first one reports results from the local coordinator baseline study, and the second one then looks at preparedness for and experiences of perioperative cardiac arrest. And one thing that I noticed when I was looking through these papers is just how much data there is in them. They're really rich with data, and it'd be really easy to sort of skim over a lot of the sort of surface messages and a lot of the data and see some bits and not see others. So what we've tried to do is sort of pick out what the key data is and what the key themes are, and hopefully we can discuss those today in the next 20 minutes to half an hour. But first, Amira, can you tell us a little bit about the key differences between the papers and what the main findings were from each?
As you say, the two papers focus on the baseline surveys, and the baseline survey was conducted at the launch of NAP7, so in June 2021. And so it aimed at investigating, first of all, the organizational survey, the local coordinator survey, investigating how hospitals and anesthetic departments are prepared to manage perioperative cardiac arrest, so at the time of the event and following in the aftermath. Whereas the individual anaesthetist survey aimed at, and it was sent out to all anaesthetists, and aimed at assessing the individuals' knowledge, current practices and beliefs, attitudes, and their past experiences of perioperative cardiac arrest. There were two sort of, in terms of debate, both of the papers were well received, and we had over 70% response rate. So 70% of hospitals answered the base paper one, so baseline survey one, and over 70% of anaesthetists, so that's nearly 11,000 anaesthetists responded to the individual anaesthetist survey.
Wow, and so much work has gone into collecting.
It's taken a long time.
Bringing it all together and analysing it. I was so impressed by, reading the papers and thinking about what must have been going on behind the scenes to get to the point where you've got a paper ready to be published from all of these individual anaesthetists and all these surveys and all these various other things. So congratulations on getting it to this stage. I know there's a lot of work that's gone into this. I found, first off, a really striking finding from the first paper was about arrangements for paediatric critical care. in hospitals that provide care for children. And obviously, not all hospitals have a intensive care environment where children can be cared for, but a lot of hospitals care for children. So did you pick out any problems around that, and were you able to speculate on anything that could be done in the future to make things safer in that regard?
Well, what we could pick out that most of the hospitals do provide paediatric care, but only 21 of the hospitals that responded had a paediatric intensive care, which meant that significant or more than sort of 90% of hospitals that do not have a PIC or PICU have to have a anaesthetic team or the intensive care team to step in to critically unwell children, and then in preparation to transfer them to a hospital that has a tertiary paediatric services.
Tim or Jazz, do you have any sort of comments about those arrangements? And I know it's something that probably a lot of us have known about working in hospitals and things, but we've actually got real data now to show that there are these differences between the levels of care that are provided in different hospitals where children are cared for.
I can pick up on that a bit. I think one of the areas of interest, so across, and one of the problems is that we've got, as you say, there's a huge amount of data that comes out of this project. We're focusing on one area, and there's bits that we can sort of pick from other areas that will come off the trees at other times. The scale of what we've looked at is enormous. I mean, I think in one of these papers, we're looking at accumulated 150,000 years of anaesthetic experience from the 11,000 anaesthetists and many tens of thousands of cardiac arrests attended. So these are massive, massive surveys. In terms of the sort of provision of anaesthesia cover and anaesthesia training and resuscitation experience, there are bits that come out of the project which we'll probably focus on a bit later. So we've previously shown that about 40% of all paediatric anaesthetics take place in DGHs. I think that's probably the same for this project. And in terms of anaesthetist subspecialties, I think paediatrics is, we found on this the fifth most frequent subspecialty, with about 15% of anaesthetists saying that it's their one of their areas of specialty. But for 85% of anaesthetists, it won't be their area of subspecialty, but they may be not only required to anaesthetize children in an elective setting, but also required to be on call, obviously in DGHs, to cover sometimes very critically ill patients. And I think this paper, which Amira might talk to a bit more, gives some insight, and certainly some of the other chapters of the projects or the reports give some insight into that. What is quite a difficult problem to solve of provision of expertise to a low frequency event, which is the critically ill child in a DGH, by individuals who may have limited pediatric experience, particularly not having day sessions, and the project as a whole raises some questions about that, but put some data around it, which is often what the NAPs do, put some data into it which can inform the discussions.
I'll say a little bit. Okay, I was just going to say a little bit more on that. In that, in the survey, about 90% of anaesthetists actually said care of children was part of their usual clinical role. So if they're on call or elective lists, only 20% or 15 to 20% had specialist training, and in paediatric anaesthesia, and importantly, only about 2/3 had training in paediatric resuscitation. So even though there's a large number whose practice includes children, it may not be regular, but there's an expectation that they would be able to manage emergencies if and when they occur, and a significant proportion, 40% have no training or no recent training for that patient group. Whereas for adults, the majority of anaesthetists have training in adult resuscitation and are confident, according to the survey, in managing adult perioperative cardiac arrest.
Yeah, I think the numbers, numbers are about 90% for adult and about 66%, so only 2/3 for children, which is a really big difference, I guess, isn't it? Amira, do you want to comment?
Yeah, and when we sub-analysed the data according to grade of anaesthetists, there wasn't that much of a difference whether a consultant was up to date, whether they've had RCUK, so Resus Council training within the last 4 years, or yearly update in paediatric defibrillation of CPR. There was not much of a difference between the grades, apart from CT1 to CT2 and anesthesia associates, which is sort of what I meant to say is which reflects their clinical practice. But there's definitely a stark difference between pediatric resuscitation training and adult resuscitation training. And what the baseline survey does, it complements this data that demonstrates that most hospitals don't actually provide yearly access to updates in resuscitation. So there's definitely a room for improvement in that aspect of care.
Yeah, that's something for me that comes out of this paper that something that we can do something about today, and we can change. So hopefully going forward, that's a real positive from the paper. Was there any other big variations in practice or deficiencies or anything else like that were revealed in the survey, Mira?
What we also found was there was a sort of huge variation of the level of emergency equipment provision. So most hospitals or most anaesthetic departments had a defibrillator available in every theatre complex. However, there was a lack of or sort of deficiency in the provision of advanced airway equipment. For example, with paediatric services, or those we asked each anaesthetic department whether every anaesthetic location where paediatric anaesthesia takes place, and whether they provided paediatric specific equipment, paediatric specific defib pads, or advanced airway equipment such as a video laryngoscope. And there was a stark difference between adult and paediatric provision. From what I remember, and just sort of reminding myself of the figures, I think about a quarter, so 15% of theatre location providing anaesthetic paediatric care did not have advanced airway equipment for that population. And this is what this means, is that we're not meeting the GPAS standard, so that's guidelines of provision of anaesthetic services, which have been recently updated in January this year.
And there's a one of the things to pick up on that is this sort of universal provision of defibrillators, and I mean it's not a massive secret, but across the project, the frequency with which defibrillation is required for perioperative cardiac arrest is really relatively small. And then there's this sort of something of a lack of provision of training in paediatric resuscitation, and overrepresentation throughout the project of paediatric problems, particularly in the younger children, and also an overrepresentation within children of airway problems. And so there's this sort of, the background is that there's a lot of very good provision. So there's particularly across adults very good, but in paediatrics there's this gap, and it's a gap in an area which is of concern, because paediatrics, particularly small children, particularly airways, remote locations, they are well represented in areas of problems. So it shows a systemic as well as an outcome issue that got to be put together.
Jazz?
Yeah, I was just going to add a bit more. So one of the things that the survey showed was that a lot of activity happens in remote locations, and nearly all departments have remote locations where they do both adult and pediatric surgery and or procedures, so radiology and so on. And the provision of equipment in those areas doesn't match what's available in main theatre complexes, and also the variation in how people would call for help. So, yeah, most main theatre complexes have some sort of alarm system, but there's huge variation. So hospitals can have an alarm system. Some have a bell, like a physical bell. Some hospitals have whistles that you might blow. Yeah, so there's a huge variation. And then once you get to remote locations, again, it's very variable, both in terms of how you call for help, and in many, it's just a case of calling the hospital-based cardiac arrest team because there's no way of guaranteeing immediate anaesthetic help. You're just relying on the arrest team. And then again, as Tim says, the equipment deficiencies seen in all hospitals at a sort of a scale much more common in remote locations such as radiology sites or remote theatres that are away from the main theatre complex. So, if you're giving an anaesthetic in one of those areas, you're on your own if something goes wrong. And you're relying on, you are relying on help coming, and that's not always well designed in many settings.
It's worth emphasising that, remote locations are not provision of a trivial amount of anaesthesia care. So probably the very small specialties, sort of ophthalmology, dental, radiology, CT, things like that, they account for almost 11% of anaesthesia care episodes, or properly remote sites. But overall, remote site anaesthesia, if you include some remote sites, a lot of obstetric sites are remote, might account for up to 20% of anaesthesia care, and out of hours a higher proportion. And pediatrics is probably is about 1 in 7 of every anaesthetic. So you put these sort of various different Venn diagrams around. Anaesthesia is no longer, delivered just in a central operating suite, but is actually delivered in all parts of the hospital, and sometimes in very complex settings. So critically ill patients in radiology, we can imagine stroke patients, etc., EVARs, etc., during the day and nighttime emergencies, likewise. So not just radiology, other centres, other areas of obstetrics. There's another area which I've forgotten, which is another cardiology, yes, interventional cardiology, etc. So these remote areas, and throughout the project, these areas sort of come up, not just in organisational structure, but also and process, but also in terms of being high risk locations for problems.
And just building on that, the survey categorised 1/3 of obstetric units as a remote location. So is that something that needs to be factored in when we're designing the hospitals of the future, that maybe, obstetric units probably shouldn't be extra buildings added on in remote locations, and they should be centralised and placed closer to operating theatres and closer to intensive care units, etc.? I'll go to Amira.
I think that's a very good question, and that because most what we've from what the activity survey has demonstrated is that a lot of activity obstetrics, and most of it is in a remote location, or a third of the obstetric units, which means that immediate help from another anaesthetist is not available straight away. So I think we should definitely factor that in.
Tim or Jazz?
I think it is an issue in obstetrics, and I think it's covered more in the obstetric sections of the report and future papers, but clearly the Ockenden report and others are now asking for greater anaesthesia presence on the delivery suite. Our activity survey shows it's the highest area for activity out of hours, overnight activity. So clearly, yeah, in a lot of units, they're looking after, yeah, and the obstetric population is becoming older, more comorbid, more obese. So it's a hot spot for potential for complications and issues, and anaesthesia departments need to factor that into their planning and organisation.
So our definition of remote site was a site which is separate from main theatres, and I think that where an immediate response, I think, was going to be more than 3 or 4 minutes to get a response team to there. So it's where critical events could occur. Obstetrics, as Jazz says, I think obstetrics is 50 to 60% of all anaesthesia activity at night time. And is almost half of it in evening time. It's also the area with and this is not in any way casting any judgment, it's the area that has the lowest proportion of consultant involvement in its care, and that may well be appropriate. But obviously, so you've got a combination of remote work, obviously caring for potentially two individuals at the same time. You've got episodes of severe hemorrhage, and you've got of necessity, because of the nature of the work, a lower proportion of work being undertaken by consultant staff out of hours, partly because it's taken out of hours. And so again, there's another sort of complex riddle that needs to be sorted out. We'll report later in the piece how that all comes together. Is obstetrics high risk or low risk for perioperative cardiac arrest? Well, that's something that'll come out. I'll leave that as a teaser. Something will come out a bit later.
And something that has actually been reported elsewhere, I saw a mention of it on Twitter recently, was about difference between male anaesthetists and female anaesthetists in terms of how confident they felt, and that men were generally more confident than women, and I have seen sort of similar research findings elsewhere recently, which were highly tweeted and things on social media. So what did the data actually say, and what can we sort of conclude from that aspect of the paper? And I'll go to Amira on this.
So we looked at one of the things that we asked each anaesthetist is on their confidence and how competent they felt in managing perioperative cardiac arrest, as well as the aftermath. And I analysed, because I was intrigued where there was a difference between the genders. And what we demonstrate is that men appear to be more confident. They were more likely to report strongly agree to managing with their capability of managing perioperative cardiac arrest. Now, in terms of why that is, I'm not too sure about that. I don't know if Jazz or Tim have any ideas.
Yeah, I can go to Tim or Jazz.
I was going to just say, so we're talking big numbers there. We had about 5,000 male anaesthetists, and 87% felt confident in managing an arrest, and we had just over 3,000 female anaesthetists and 79%. So the difference is relatively small. But I think it's important that we've looked at this, but we haven't looked at actual performance. It's clearly a trait that needs looking at and needs further exploration, in that you want someone who's confident but may not perform well, as opposed to someone who's less confident but does perform well. So yeah, and clearly it's probably not, most of these arrests are attended by more than one person. In fact, data shows that most anaesthetists who attend a cardiac arrest, there's several there. And we didn't dig deep into this, but it would have been interesting to see who took on the leadership roles and stuff. And and how people interacted as a team.
And there's definitely scope by the looks of things for training staff in how to conduct debriefs, because one of the other findings was that across the board, lots of anaesthetists weren't all that confident about leading debriefs, and I think debriefs we're recognising are increasingly important for such events.
Yeah, I think perhaps that reflects on our training. I know I've recently completed my anaesthetics training and became a consultant, and I don't really recall ever having any training specific to managing the aftermath, not just the debrief process, but also communicating with relatives and the next of kin. All I recall is, when I've been doing RC UK training in resuscitation, that's when I've had some training within that aspect, but otherwise it's not really part of the curriculum.
I'm going to ask all of you one final question before we finish, but you're only allowed to give a one-word answer. So, do we anaesthetise patients in theatre or in the anaesthetic room? And I'll start with Jazz.
I'm only allowed one answer, I'd say theatre.
Well, Amira and I work in the same hospital, and we don't use anaesthetic rooms either. I don't think you can do a randomised controlled trial to look at safety using anaesthetic rooms or not using anaesthetic rooms. I think that it would change too many things when you do that. So the NAPs are quite useful for looking, or they're very useful for looking at rare events that you can't really look at with RCTs. And so we have got a chapter inevitably, we've got a chapter in the NAPs looking at, we've got one looking at transfers, we've got one looking at monitoring, we've got one looking at anaesthetic rooms. We've tried to tease out some of the not, I think it will inform the discussion. It doesn't give a definitive answer, but it provides some pointers, some information. It's interesting that during the pandemic, everybody flipped from, so we had about roughly 90% of people of patients were anaesthetized in the anaesthetic room pre-pandemic. It's a little bit less than that now, but during the pandemic, it flipped, and 80, 90, 95% were anaesthetized in theatre.
Overall, in the UK, there's been an increase in the use of operating rooms, so patients are more and more likely to be anaesthetized in theatre.
There's going to be 2 papers obviously published today, and there will be another 3 main papers coming out in the near future as well, and there'll be several other papers coming out after that on subspecialties, so lots more to come. But for now we're just concentrating on these 2 papers, and I'd really encourage everyone to read them in full, because there's no substitute for that. So thank you very much, Tim and Amira and Jazz. Both papers are free to read, free forever. Open access, so please do go away and download the papers and read them in full, and let us know if you've got any questions. Send us your letters, tweet us, we'll respond. Tim's very good at responding on Twitter, and he will answer any of your questions. If you've got particular queries about any of the methods used, or what a particular conclusion that's drawn from the paper, we will try our best to answer those on Twitter, or on X as it's called these days. So thank you very much, and we'll see you very soon for another interview where we're going to be talking with Andrew Kane, and colleague from a brand new editor from Australia, Mary Ann's going to be talking to Andrew, and Tim and Jazz might also be joining, and that's going to be another excellent paper.